building a culture of pace, knocking down barriers, 80-20 rule, moving fast is absolutely critical. And it's not something academic institutions are good at because they value precision in accuracy and I's being dotted and T's being crossed. And so pushing through that and pulling hard against that is absolutely critical to every startup, every spin-out.
Welcome to the Lab to Market Leadership Podcast. Too many advanced science and engineering companies fail to deliver their innovations from the lab to the market. We are on a mission to change that. My name is Chris Reichhelm, and I'm the founder and CEO of Deep Tech Leaders. Each week, we speak with some of the world's leading entrepreneurs, investors, corporates, and policymakers about what it takes to succeed on the lab to market journey. Join us. Let me say up front that university spinouts are fundamental to the success of deep tech as a movement. The research, the breakthroughs, the innovation that come from academics and researchers are the foundation stones on which deep tech and all its various domains rests. Okay? But let me also say that university spinouts can be incredibly frustrating as well. Not just them as companies, but also the university spinout process. In the UK, there's been a great deal of conversation around this, particularly located around stakes that universities take, the time it takes for technology transfer offices to actually move through and incorporate and spin out companies, questions around intellectual property and the ownership of that IP, etc. So it is a frustrating process, and it is a slow process in many cases too. And that slowness impacts the success of spinouts and impacts their ability to move from lab to market quickly. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by a partner at Albion Ventures, a guy named Dave Grimm. And Dave, for the last decade, has been working with Albion and one of the UK's leading universities, University College London. And together, they've been fashioning a new way of engagement, a new way of engagement in my view, one that is smoother, one that is a little bit more standardized, one that is prioritizing pace. And I think this is exciting as it can be for the spinout administration process. And yet, unless you're willing to look at this process, you can't really have a hope of making it better for young spinouts. So I want to get into it with Dave today. I want to understand what exactly about their program have they done that is leading to this success. And the guys are having success. They're producing some really interesting companies. I'll highlight two, Phasecraft and Oriole Networks, both of which have raised a fair amount of money. And they've got a whole future of compute portfolio that is very interesting too. So I'm hoping that Dave is going to get into some of the stuff that they've done to create this more organic, symbiotic relationship that is leading to success. If you're into spinouts, if you care about that spinout process, I think you're going to love this episode. Let's get into it. Dave Grimm, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me on.
Deep tech investing means many different things to many different people and investors. What does it mean to Albion? Kind of walk me through the history of deep tech and Albion, because they weren't always a deep tech investor.
Deep tech investing to us is where you invest into a technical differentiation that's going to last for long enough for it to be valuable in the marketplace, and long enough for that technology to be developed to the point where that will be valuable. Actually, we've been doing it without calling it deep tech for many, many years. In fact, it's only, I don't know when the deep tech label really sort of became en vogue. It was only in the last few years that deep tech has become fashionable. But in fact, at Albion, we've been trying to back companies with differentiation for decades. So that sometimes that will have been technical differentiation that we believed in, alongside founder differentiation or market execution differentiation. So now when we talk about deep tech investing, we're talking about is there some patents, or is there some technical know-how, or is there something at the heart of this business that means that we can't just go and get 5 engineers skilled in the art and get them to do the same thing.
Yes,
and that's a very broad definition, but in truth, deep tech is a very broad space.
But it is true. I mean, I can remember probably 15 years ago, Albion had an investment in a company called Process Systems Enterprise that we actually worked with. And it was a university spin out from Imperial, I think. And I think today was ultimately acquired by Siemens from memory. But it was a classic example of the company you've just described. But again, we didn't refer to it as deep tech back then. The terms just weren't used. And how, in terms of, do you take a fairly broad view of deep tech today? In other words, are you investing only in particular areas and not others?
Yeah, good question. So we have two different sort of distinct strategies there. So we have our larger kind of flagship funds, and they have quite defined areas of deep tech that we think are the most exciting to go after. So those are future compute, energy transition, novel AI. But we also have a university IP strategy where we're going very early and helping create businesses out of IP at universities at a very early stage. And there, I think we're willing to sort of look a little bit broader in our scope and across everything from kind of medtech and therapeutics through to kind of software at the other end, and then sort of hardware sitting somewhere between those two. So in our flagship funds, we have a bit more defined strategy around 3 verticals we think are most exciting. And then in our university strategy, we're taking a broader flow of IP and trying to figure out if we can match it to exciting markets.
Yeah. What are the challenges that you guys find in deep tech investing?
There's lots of them. I think the easy answer here is capital, and everyone will tell you there's not enough capital in deep tech. I'm not going to sort of dwell on that because I think that's a fairly sort of accepted view. I think a lot of the time the challenges come down to time to get kind of product market fit, time from kind of taking a technology and actually getting it into a customer's hands as a technology, and then taking it from being a technology to a product. It's a big old chunk of time. And requires a specific technological development skill set. But once you've then got a product, you've then got a completely different entity, and you don't necessarily need sort of technological sort of deep understanding at that point. You more need kind of execution and commercial understanding, and so there's almost a skill set transition point as well, and where you kind of build those skills and experience into the business is kind of an art form. Because it's fairly true that in most of the investments I've made, at the very earliest stages, the technology is not proven or advanced enough that you can go and hoover up the best domain space talent in the world to kind of help lead these businesses forward. So you got to figure out, how do you build a talent pathway and a hiring plan and get everyone on board with how you grow the business from, a piece of kit on a lab bench to a product being sold to specific ICPs in enterprises. And you can see the change in dynamics through that journey is kind of wild.
Yeah. And it's, you offer up this distinction just there between the technological part of the journey, which is demonstrating the tech, building it out, and then obviously the commercialization piece. And it's in our experience, so few businesses ever really complete trying to prove out their technology proposition. And so few get to the point where they're able to articulate that into a value proposition with some meaning and resonance in a particular value chain. And so, are you guys in your portfolio seeing more of those companies make that transition? Or are you seeing the same kind of odds, more or less, that the rest of us see?
I think, like you say, the odds are against these companies getting to a stage where they're really sort of delivering product. I think what we're trying to work on is how we change that paradigm. In particular, how do you build teams that can, so you can get to a point where you just sell the technology to an acquirer, and you see a lot of these kind of early-ish tech exits for values south of 100 million. And that can be a great return if you've got in at the right stage and you're small enough fund to make that work. But ultimately, that's not going to drive a really healthy ecosystem that can grow businesses to scale. And so again, I think a lot of the time we are working quite closely with leadership teams and putting talent in and moving talent around to allow them to make that transition. And where we do that successfully, and it's not an easy thing to do successfully, but where it's done successfully, it does make that difference. So putting in a founder that's able to take a business commercial and has the ambition and the hunger, and having designed the cap table so you can bring them in and incentivize them properly to go and do that massively exciting part of the journey is absolutely critical. Otherwise, you're almost certainly setting yourself up for a tech exit. And we do a lot of that. It comes right back down to the very first foundings of the business. How do you set up the capital structure of the business? How do you set expectations and have people aligned for what the journey might look like as it kind of goes from 0 to 1 and then 1 to 10 and 10 to 100? And I think we're now at a stage we've done that enough. We're able to share some pretty cool stories of people's journeys with other founders that starts to help lubricate that thinking.
Yes. Can you share some of those lessons with us?
I can think of founders that have started the journey. Right at the start, we've been able to say, this is the first 2 years of the journey and what it looks like. But we are going to bring in a domain-specific commercial leader at this point, and they're probably going to be CEO. You will still be valuable to the business. You'll still look, we're going to find a way. You'll still be either CSO or CTO going forward. But as we found the business now, we need you to work really hard and take it to this stage in the knowledge that when it gets to this stage, you'll be handing your baby to someone else for the good of its growth, and that we will care for you and ensure that your participation in the future of that business is satisfying. And being able to have that authentic chat, like before you've even founded the company, before you've even got a vehicle, is pretty critical. I've done that a few times, and that's when we've seen the best CEO transitions have been when you kind of put the hard yards in 2 or 3 years before you make the CEO transition.
Yes. So that expectation setting right up front and laying out the journey of the next couple of years. And these founders, I'm assuming, are often technical founders who may also fashion themselves as the CEO of the business too at that point.
Yeah. And quite often because they feel they need to, rather than they're necessarily desperate to be that. But they feel like they're coming to the VC community, they need to project a certain type of personality. And so, I like to sort of be quite open with founders and say, don't think of me as a typical VC. You don't have to sell me a story. Let's get actually into what you want and what we want, because you might find that we're more aligned than you think we are.
Yes. Do you feel that gives them a sense of relief?
Some ways. Some does, some don't. Yeah, sometimes it does. Some founders really want to be the CEO for the long term, and they don't. This message isn't one they want to hear. So there's not a one size fits all, and that's hopefully why I think my job is not really automated in the next year or two. Is that I think it's much more of an art, this bit, than a science. There's no kind of perfect formula. I quite often get asked, particularly LPs for funds that we're raising to go into universities, I was like, what are you looking for? What's the perfect founding team look like? And quite often you're sort of bespoke building something rather than saying, right, I need it to look like this, and this, because often you can't have like that perfect formula to start with.
Yes. Yes. But having said that, what kind of features are you looking for in entrepreneurs or in entrepreneurial teams when you're investing?
Yes, there's a few different archetypes that we like. My sort of favorite one is Mark Andreessen's favorite one too. I remember he said this on a podcast about university spinouts well over a decade ago, which is you kind of want your professor or your PI, an academic leading a world's body of research, and then you want to pluck one entrepreneurial hungry person out of his group who understands the technology enough, but has not become a kind of career academic, kind of young and hungry, and you can build those two things together. They're often really excellent foundation stages of the business. If you can get that, then that's one to really try and engineer. The other, like I've seen successful from the early stages, is if you bring in if you've got an academic who's world class in their field, and you can bring in a domain expert who's built a business before in that space and who's going back around to do it again. That works quite well, and that actually can be done if they've been successful on their first time round, because then their risk appetite goes up a bit because they're willing to go and do something a bit mad because they don't need it to be, don't need it to secure their children's future or whatever it is. And so you can bring them in. So if the idea is exotic and exciting enough, you can bring them in. So that's another quite good sort of foundation stage of a business. And then you can have academics who are entrepreneurial enough to get out there and start and create a business and run it. Quite often there's a time limitation on that one, but that's quite nice when you've got that, because you haven't got lots of leadership mouths to feed at that stage. You can set up the capital structure such that they can do some time, and then it can be leadership team can broaden out once they've made enough technical progress that you can bring in a sufficiently high caliber level of domain expertise alongside.
Yes. I imagine that for some of those repeat entrepreneurs, motivation is quite an important feature to be looking at there.
It all comes down to personality type and drive and hunger, and it's definitely something in Europe and in the UK where it's something culturally that makes that a lot more difficult for us than it does for our US customers. I'll give you an example. Give you an interesting kind of example of this. We have a semiconductor business in our portfolio, and we were looking to bring in new leadership. And very specifically, we wanted to bring in someone from the West Coast who was part of the kind of semiconductor Silicon Valley flow. My initial instincts was this is going to need an enormous amount of energy and drive. This person's going to have to be, jetting backwards and forwards from San Fran to the UK and then out to Asia, because semiconductor is very global in that respect. So, in my head, I was like, this needs to be someone in their kind of 30s, 40s, like who's got just loads of energy and time for this. We went to a specialist semiconductor recruiter in the US, and the first few profiles they showed me, they were all 60 years plus. And my reaction was, these guys are just not going to be up for it. These guys are not going to have the energy. And the recruiter said, chat to them, see what you think. And I was kind of blown away by some of them very successful already, made comfortable lives for themselves. And yet they were very keen to go around and spend another 15 years doing the hard grind at 50 or 60. I think in the UK, the majority of our successful entrepreneurs who are in their 60s are not looking to CEO their next business. It's something about the US kind of culture and American dream means that then it's kind of so ingrained that it seems to be that you work until the very last moments, and you're very happy to do that. That's a huge boost to that ecosystem, because that recycling of talent and that flywheel that you need to build a really successful venture ecosystem just has a lot longer to spin in the US than does in the UK.
So do we need to acknowledge that in the UK and Europe? What is more likely? Are we going to change the behavior of the entrepreneurial ecosystem over here and say, are they going to start unretiring, so to speak? I think there was an article. It's been doing the rounds of Substack or LinkedIn. Someone calling. It was the CEO of Helsing calling for Torsten, calling for the unretiring of Europe's entrepreneurs, so that they can get back into the system and apply the lessons that they've learned to make Europe great again, so to speak. Is that more likely, or is it more likely that Europe and the UK's entrepreneurial talent will retire at their first win, and we need to adjust to that?
That's a huge question. I think because of a lot of our talent has spent time in the US, I think you're seeing more and more talent willing to go the second time, third time around. You also get a few that have had quite short cycles and therefore able to get back into the ecosystem and help. I think, for instance, of Ian Hogarth, I know very well.
Yes,
successful exited founder, and still very young, and so the amount of value he's adding to the ecosystem across a number of different.
But the value he is adding, and that's a great example. But I think the value Ian's adding is kind of different. He's serving as investor and kind of government advisor a little bit, and he's doing a lot of different things, but not necessarily wearing the CEO hat and getting back into the fray.
Yeah, that's true. But I could absolutely see him and those like him doing that. I don't think that's he wants to retire type problem. I think that's more like the opportunity to be a really great actor as a funder in the UK and Europe is differentiated from that in the US. And so I think he's serving a purpose that needs to be fulfilled. I think were those gaps already filled, I would imagine he would be probably CEOing something.
Yes. So, no, that's right.
I think the point is, I was making with Ian is kind of there are those that have gone through the cycle quick enough.
Yes,
they are still
that's true.
Enough to go again.
That's true. No, that's absolutely
increasingly
true.
Increasingly so, I think.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about the UCL fund that you've been, and a very important part of, I think, since its founding.
That's right.
Share with us a little bit about that. What was it initially set out to do? There have been lots of university funds that are out there. There still are. What did you guys set out to do with UCL? What's been achieved in the time that this has been in place?
Yeah, good question. I think that what we set out to do, and what maybe differentiates us from some of the other efforts, is that we wanted to kind of have a kind of harmonious molding of a VC sort of knitted into the fabric of the university in a way that made us a good actor for everyone. I think for a long time, deep tech VCs have sort of approached universities and either sat too far away and just said service like good companies, and then they've turned up once a month, looked at the IP flow and gone, well, there isn't a great company here yet, so I'm not doing anything. And you've seen there's so many examples of funds that have been raised at universities that have not deployed because they're not close enough. There's a lot of antagonism between the VC and the university because they are very different entities and they don't see eye to eye on a bunch of different things. And each has their own perspective, but it causes a mistrust from the university and the VC, and the VC doesn't doesn't hold the university in high regard and eventually sort of operates separately to it. But I think we wanted to see if we could build a fund where we solved for those problems and actually put like a VC that was a kind of friend to everyone in the heart of the university that allowed to sort of break the mold of IP and innovation not quite gaining the right profile or the right formation in order to attract VC money. So we actually got much closer to the tech transfer office and the university and the departments than I think has been typically seen before. And we tried to sort of broker thoughts and programs and investments that didn't leave everyone with a sour taste in their mouth. And that actually ended up working very well. So, I think people in the tech transfer office at UCL still respect us and take on board our views about how much equity they should be taking, how fast things should be moving, all these things that we have opinions on. Equally, we are not out there telling the world that universities are awful places and bureaucratic and awful and slow and unable to do their job properly, because I think that's an unfair characterization of them too, but you often hear from the VC community. So I think we've managed to kind of build a world where we really understand each other. And that's led to us being able to be a much more kind of trusted partner of the university. And that means we've been really deep in all of the IP flow, in all the conversations with the academics as they're trying to build stuff and saying, actually, as a VC, this is how we think we should do it, and being trusted for that opinion. That's allowed us to create companies and create ventures at the heart of the university in a manner that means that they've got a chance to become a global category leader, but otherwise they would never have got off the shelf. The IP would have rotted there because the tech transfer office would have wanted to do it one way, the VC community would have seen it differently, they would have thought, they would have all assumed it was everyone else's fault, and the opportunity would never have escaped. So we're proud of that relationship that we've built.
I mean, this seems very unusual. And I'll use the word unusual because there have been lots of funds around universities that have been trying to build those very same type of relationships. And indeed, many funds that claim they do have those kinds of relationships. But you get further into the academic ecosystem, and then you hear very mixed reviews with a number of them. And it's also, and it's often with, a similar set of complaints, stepping on toes, this inability to determine ultimately if the investors are there to support the academic community or if the investors are there to help develop outstanding companies. And there's a difference. There's a distinction there. And that's always, I imagine that's a very fine line to walk. What has, in your experience, and you're a guy that's well known in the ecosystem, what has made it different for you guys? Why have you guys been more successful in doing this than other funds?
I think one thing that characterizes Albion through and through, I think our founding partner, Patrick, with us others, is kind of taking a long-term view on things. So in each deal, you can fight and kill for an extra percentage. You can push your agenda here and there, but if you've got a sort of, look, this has to work over a 20-year view, we're not going to go and just get 2 or 3 deals and burn our bridges and go, because we really believe in the long-term value of what we're doing. Then you're approaching it with an attitude of patience and humility, which are not characteristics often found in VCs. And we've had to really double down on emphasizing those characteristics at times. And there are times when I found it extraordinarily hard to interface with a public institution, and there are a million different ways that universities can be very frustrating partners to deal with. And I'm sure they might say the same thing about me as a sort of private from the private sector. But I think we've all sort of committed to patience and open communication and taking a long-term view. And then we've hired for that, and the people we have in the fund, they were diplomatic with the way we work with the university, and everyone is in it to build a 20, 30, 40-year success story. And that's, Albion's been around for 30 years. We intend to be around for at least another 30 years. Everything about the way our partnership works and the way that our hiring works and the way that our culture is set up for the long term. And I think that is really very unusual in the VC world. And that's why we've been able to bring that kind of attitude and culture to this, and it's made it work.
And have you gotten the alignment, say, at the top of UCL, at the top of the institution, so that, because creating that alignment throughout the institution obviously makes it much easier for you to be able to do your job?
Yeah, I mean, we've relationships throughout the university. Mm-hmm. It's funny though, like UCL, and I think all universities in some extent are quite anarchic places. Often it doesn't really matter what the person at the top thinks anyway, because it sort of gets lost through a whole bunch of different power structures and stuff. So it's not just having the people at the top. It's much more about having worked with people who are the doers at the university, who are getting stuff done, and getting them to understand, spending time educating them. This is why we're setting it up like this. This is why, with the cap table structure should look like this, and believe us that this will be a good outcome. I'll give you maybe an example of how that played out really, really well. Quite early on, we could see that there was an issue with the way that software was being dealt with at the university. So universities in the UK predominantly have made their money historically from sort of life sciences, or at least physical science, but mainly life science investment. And there, it is not uncommon for the cap tables and structures to look very different from the rest of the VC ecosystem. So you see founders on very small percentages and investors on very large percentages, and there's a different kind of mindset, and you're going for enormous outcomes. So small percentages kind of can work for founders in those scenarios, but it absolutely doesn't work in a software spin out. And so when there's been lots of talk about this in the press, and when you're taking 30% of a software spin out, you're pretty much killing it from the moment it starts. And so the ultimate effect of that is that software is quite easy to walk off with. So if you're going to start a software business from the university, what you do is you leave the university with your laptop, and then you start your business, and the university gets nothing. And actually the spin out, or what would have been a spin out, suffers because it loses access to a whole load of talent that typically they could bring in. So we had this conversation with UCL that went on for a while, because it takes time to kind of change fairly sort of bureaucratic public institutions at times. But just saying, look, from a software perspective, you shouldn't be trying to take huge stakes. And what happens is you get large stakes in 2 or 3 businesses, and the rest disappear or they don't start. You'd be far better off taking small slivers, low single-digit percentages of every software business, which you make it so attractive and so easy to do and so small that everyone will just do it automatically. You'll get lots of small slivers, and ultimately your return will probably be better. And we did that. So we instituted a program. We got signed off at UCL, set in motion, which was basically a 5% deal for any software startup. The very first startup that took that deal was a medical technology software startup. And they took that deal, and it meant that their spin-out process was a third the length it would have been otherwise, because otherwise they dive into these deep negotiations and it all gets voted, and it just takes forever. Anyway, it moved it so much faster, but they spun out very quickly, and then were fortunate enough to be in spin out in time to win quite a big grant. Otherwise, they would have missed. And then sold to, not on the thick end of 100 million inside 3 years. University still owned basically 5% of that business as it sold. And that was a big payout back to the computer science department, back to the university. And a business, otherwise, if they had tried to take more, or even if they had ended up on the same amount, but they've negotiated for longer, that business may well take a different course, or it wouldn't have started at all. And when they start to see those little wins and start to see how that works, and you get a lot more sort of hearts and minds, you start to get a bit more trust from the institution. over the last decade, we've built up, really sort of deep levels of trust.
Oh, that's an outstanding result. And if only we could get the rest of the leading universities in the UK to follow suit.
It is the direction of travel.
It is
the direction of travel. And certainly on the software side, you see more and more in that realm. Hardware is more difficult.
Yes. Tell us about the insights you've gained or lessons learned from the spin-out process, and including the process of spinning out these companies, incorporation, and so on, and then also supporting startups in the early days. What should people take away, from your experience?
If I wanted people to just remember one thing from this conversation, it would be about pace from the off. So there's a mode which is you've got some technology in a university, some IP, and then there's a patenting process, and that takes a while. And then you've got your patent, and so there's a sort of, we've got the patents that are protected, and so then it can take let's then think about starting the startup. We're going to negotiate over the start cap table, and we're going to take our time. Before you know it, 18 months to 2 years has kind of slipped by while it got going, and there's a false security in the fact that there's a patent there that makes people think, we can, it's better to take our time and get this right. And because we've got this kind of moat which will last for 20 years. So if it takes 2 years to found a business, that's marginal. I always give this example to universities when I'm talking to them, is that Apple patented the click wheel in 2004. So you're old enough as mine to remember the iPod with the little clicky wheel song selection, pre-touchscreen. So they patented that in 2004. I think I finished a bunch of patents for it. It was like at the beginning of 2005. And then they launched the iPad Touch and the iPhone in 2007. And those patents became basically worthless. they actually innovated and destroyed the value of their own patents, which is the right thing for them to do. But you could easily have been an academic patenting it and thinking, I've got this great way now of, I've got all this time. Patents protect you from one very specific attack vector, which is someone doing exactly the same thing as you. But there are many, many ways people can do something which destroys the value of what you were trying to do. And so taking your time or being slow in the first case is a false, it's false security and patents. So you need to build an idea of pace and execution to the business from the off. And then the problem with that sort of slow process is it doesn't build a culture of pace and execution. It builds a culture of dotting the I's and crossing the T's. And, you only have to read any of the most kind of lauded tomes in VC and entrepreneurship sort of writing to say that isn't the right way to execute. And so, building a culture of pace, knocking down barriers, 80-20 rule, moving fast is absolutely critical. And it's not something academic institutions are good at because they value precision in accuracy and I's being dotted and T's being crossed. And so pushing through that and pulling hard against that is absolutely critical to every startup, every spin-out.
Yes. Do you get the sense that change is afoot and that they're taking they've accepted the desire for a change of behavior. Sorry, they've accepted the need for this change of behavior and that they're doing something about it?
I think the leading academic institutions, I think like in London, there's, across Imperial and others, I see a lot of that attitude and a lot of acceptance. I mean, certainly on the kind of cap table stuff, I think there's been some strong positive movement there. The pace thing is a harder one. I think there's an acceptance that that's needed, but actually how you do that when you have some complex structures, legal departments, and incentivization structures which maybe don't reward the upside so much as just avoiding the downside. those things are difficult, and putting in place a different incentivization structure in a university public body is complex, and so there are some underlying structural challenges, which means that's never easy. And I go back to the thing that we built with UCL, means that we understand that, right? So I can go to the tech transfer office or to one of the universities and say, I understand this is why it is, but we need it to look like this. So how can we figure out a way to get through it, rather than just shaking God fist and all and saying, well, it isn't working, and what you do, you just need to do your job faster, because that's not a religious expectation of a public institute.
But also demonstrating that the alternative leads to success, like you did with this medical software startup. So if you go down this path with us, look, a really good example. This is what can happen. And then, of course, they've got to create the association between the pace that you identify and that win. So given that the government, that grant wouldn't have come forward had they not incorporated in the time that they needed, then one could surmise that the rest wouldn't have followed, or would have been less likely to follow. But that it's an education process, and they need to see some precedent as well. That if we move faster, if we're willing to be more entrepreneurial in our own dealings and move these out, or at least create a set of standards, that means that a lot of this is boilerplate. And so we can move really fast. And then, and that may be the best way of supporting these young companies when they spin out.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head on the standardization, though, because that really does help with pace. And that requires a lot of buy-in from a lot of different people at universities, and takes time and energy, but is absolutely worth it. And something that we've spoken a lot about in our time at UCL and in the wider university ecosystem. And it is slowly coming. Certainly seen, Imperial have got some interesting programs that try to do similar things, Founder's Choice and other bits and pieces. There is a recognition of this. And I think the closer that the universities are to the VC ecosystem, the more that trusted bridges are built rather than antagonistic fish shaking. I think the better chance you've got of everyone moving and accepting a slightly different paradigm to get things done.
Yes. Let me switch tack a bit, if you don't mind. Let's take a step back and look at kind of UK deep tech, generally speaking, and its progress. We are, and this will be no surprise, considered generally very good at the fundamental invention and innovation, and perhaps getting to a kind of a good pilot, TRL 6 or 7. And then, we have that valley of death to get to a commercial grade, first of a kind. And we really need to be ramping up commercialization efforts. And then generally we see a lot of fallout there. So so all of that is a long way of saying we're really good at the early stage stuff. We're less good at the growth stage stuff. And we've had this issue for as long as I've been in the UK, 31 years. We had it in software. And now, we have it in deep tech even more. And you can understand why we'd have it in deep tech more, because it's far more complex. It involves a lot of operational challenges, manufacturing and scale-up challenges, new materials, and the like. Funding is a huge challenge for us. And I'd like us to talk about that too, about what you think can happen to unlock additional funding. But putting funding aside right now, what are some of the other challenges that you see holding us back, preventing us from being able to scale more of these businesses?
Yeah, good question. So firstly, I would say I don't think it's ambition. Quite often, you see it sort of the founders here don't have the sort of ambition of the US, and therefore they don't build these huge companies, and they're willing to sell out earlier and all that kind of stuff. I think that is actually just a function of there not being enough capital. If you go out to raise money and the market is only willing to put 10 million in as opposed to put 40 million in, you have to scale your ambition to what the market can fund, rather than sort of try and try and shoot for the moon when you haven't got enough money to actually get to achieve what you need. And so I think we have some very ambitious founders, but I wasn't allowed to mention funding as the main reason, but like I would say that lack of funding does sort of tailor the ambition that founders have. And they quite rightly sell out when they can't raise more money, or they tailor their business to reach a point where they can sell because they know they can't raise hundreds of millions.
Dave, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a lot of fun and really, really interesting insights. And I thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me on. I've enjoyed it. It's been really, really great to chat.
You've been listening to the Lab to Market Leadership Podcast, brought to you by Deep Tech Leaders. This podcast has been produced by Bauhaus. You can find out more about us on LinkedIn, Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.